I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Learn how you can put geopolitics to work for your organization at ranenetwork.com.
Hello and welcome to this episode of RANE's Essential Geopolitics podcast. On May 10th, India and Pakistan announced a ceasefire following 3 days of conflict that brought up concerns of potential war between the two nations. Here to discuss the ceasefire is RANE's South Asia analyst, Misha Iqbal, and RANE's Director of Analysis, Adriano Bosoni. Welcome to the podcast, guys.
Thank you so much for having us again. And hello, Misha. It's really nice to share a podcast with you.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So, Misha, the conflict between India and Pakistan made a lot of people around the world worried. There was a real risk of an escalation that would have much bigger consequences because, of course, we are talking about two nuclear countries. So while having nuclear weapons works as deterrence and sometimes reduces the risk of a broader war, it also means that if there is a broader war, things could get very, very complicated very quickly. But this dates back to several decades ago, right? This is not a conflict that has emerged in recent years. It has very deep roots with historical, political, religious, and territorial factors that go back at the very least to the 1940s and the time when the British Empire left its possessions in India. So before we talk about the current phase of the conflict, I think we should start maybe not from the beginning, but with a little bit of a history lesson. So why there is this deep animosity between India and Pakistan?
Yeah, and like you mentioned, India and Pakistan's relationship is marked by deep mistrust, conflict, and these downgraded ties. And this dates back to the partition in 1947, where India and Pakistan split to form two different countries. And this was primarily driven by growing Hindu and Muslim political divisions during the British rule. The Muslim League, which was led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, wanted a separate Islamic state, so basically Pakistan, to protect interests, or Muslim interests. And then the Indian National Congress wanted a state based on secularism. And so there were some tensions with that, but ultimately that's what led to the partition. And it was overseen by, the British. And this was the largest mass migration in history. It also led to, a large amount of communal violence. And so, that history really, really fuels what the Pakistan-India tensions are about. And there was a lot of unresolved issues in that, but the most notable one was about the ownership of Kashmir, which, has set the stage of where we are today. So
if I understand correctly, each side controls a part of Kashmir and they claim the other part?
Yeah, so initially Kashmir actually went to India. That's where Kashmir was a princely state, and so the ruler acceded to India, but Pakistan would claim Kashmir because it had a Muslim majority population, and so it really fit into its own national interest. And so ultimately, they fought 3 wars over this, and we still see frequent tensions. And so after the war, that's when the UN came in and they brokered a ceasefire in 1949, and that led to the creation of a line of control, or the LOC, which is a de facto border which divides Kashmir, like you mentioned. So there's India-administered Kashmir and Pakistan-administered Kashmir, and that's what established that division.
And how was the line of separation decided? Back then there was an agreement, both sides were happy with it. Why there are still conflicts about it if there was an agreement back then?
Well, I wouldn't say both sides were exactly happy with it because, both would have wanted the full Kashmir. But, the the wars and the fighting was quite deadly, and so that's why they initially agreed to it. But yeah, we still see fighting, and that lends itself to a lot of issues. You mentioned how multidimensional this conflict is. There's a land issue, there's a resource issue in terms of water. With India, the big one is militancy. So they accuse Pakistan of supporting insurgency in Indian-administered Kashmir. And, the issue of cross-border terrorism is a major obstacle of peace. You've seen lots of high-profile attacks in India that India links to Pakistan, such as, the Mumbai attacks in 2008 or the 2019 Pulwama bombing. So that's really what's driving these tensions forward.
Yeah, that's very interesting. The issue of militancy is very interesting in the sense that Pakistan can always argue that they have nothing to do with the militants, that they are also trying to fight militancy, and that they are trying to prevent terrorism. What's the relationship between Pakistan and the multiple militant groups that operate on its side of the border, and sometimes they carry out attacks on the Indian side of the border?
Yeah, I mean, Pakistan denies all these claims. It does have its own internal issues of militant threats as well. We see that in Balochistan, which actually Pakistan accuses of India. So there is a denial. There has been evidence that there has been links to Pakistan in these groups, and some of it has been sponsored. Even like when we look at India-administered Kashmir and the militancy that goes on there, it's linked a lot to a separatist movement, and Pakistan supports them through statements, and they say it's a freedom struggle, not like a terrorism issue. So things like that, that's what kind of clouds Pakistan's linkage to it, just because it's they deny it, but there are some links that India continues to cite. Which
takes us to the most recent incident on May 7, when India reacted to what it denounced as a Pakistan-sponsored terrorist attack on its territory, right?
Yes.
So can you please explain us what exactly happened?
Yeah, so this goes, to understand what happened on May 7th, this goes back to an attack on April 22 in Indian-administered Kashmir. It was a militant attack that killed over 24 civilians, and this was the deadliest attack on civilians in India in years. And this appears to be carried out by a group called the Resistance Front. This group typically carries out smaller scale sporadic attacks on non-locals in Kashmir in opposition to the Indian government and their policies in Indian-administered Kashmir. And India has said that the Resistance Front is a front for the Pakistani militant group Lashkar-e-Taiba. And this is also bolstered by the fact that India claims that 2 of the alleged attackers are Pakistani. So this really drove India's accusations of Pakistan's complicity in this attack. Pakistan, like we have seen in the past, has denied this and accused of blaming them without providing sufficient evidence. And following, this attack, this is when India took some non-kinetic measures, and a series of tit-for-tat measures that downgraded bilateral ties took place. So we saw India cut diplomatic staff. They closed the Tari-Wagah border, which was the only operational land crossing with Pakistan. They stopped issuing Pakistani visas to Pakistani nationals. But most notably, and I'm sure we'll get into this in more detail later on, but they suspended the Indus Water Treaty, which governs the sharing of the Indus River system between the 2 countries. So this, especially with the water treaty, really kind of escalated, the diplomatic ties that they have, or the downgrade of the diplomatic ties that they had, the few that they did. And so in response, Pakistan closed off its airspace to Indian carriers, halted all trade with India, and canceled visas for Indian nationals. So, with that escalation, we also saw some kinetic exchanges apart from the May 7th attack that you just mentioned, we saw, some firing across the border, which eventually escalated to, like you said, India launching those strikes on May 7th.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because things got really serious a few days into the conflict when India and Pakistan, they attacked each other's air bases. I think this was like the first drone battle between the two countries. Would you say that it was because they have nuclear weapons that they decided to have a conversation and stop the escalation ladder? Would you say that it was fear of a broader war? Would you say that it was foreign pressure from China, the United States, and others? Do you think that they got so close to things spiraling out of control that they decided to pause? What do you think prevented a major escalation?
Yeah, I think there were a few drivers. I mean, like you mentioned, this was, the air base attacks were a lot deeper into each territories than, we've typically seen in past attacks. So that's already unprecedented and kind of alarmed both. And then, also international pressure. We saw a lot of allies. We saw like the US, China, Turkey, other like Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia, all kind of chime in and help with the ceasefire. So I think that was another driver. And then also just overall what's happening internally, more so for Pakistan, just the economic challenges that they're having. A continued conflict would certainly exacerbate some of those challenges, even though there was a lot of domestic pressure on both sides to show resolve, to continue demonstrating. I think after, they did that on May 7th, that was enough and was sufficient enough. And so, they really didn't want a further escalation.
That's interesting. Do you think the economy played a role at all? It's quite interesting because we're talking about two very different economies in very different shape. India is a very large, very robust, fast-growing economy. Pakistan is a much smaller economy in the middle of a IMF bailout, facing serious macroeconomic difficulties. Do you think that the economic side influenced maybe Pakistan a bit more than India? I guess India has more resources for a sustained conflict.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, overall, I feel like any country, like the cost of war is definitely something that they consider. But yeah, like you mentioned with Pakistan, it's definitely more, it would hurt Pakistan more. Like you mentioned, India is a bigger economy, can absorb more of those costs, versus Pakistan is more of a sensitive area. It is in the midst, like you mentioned, in an IMF program. And so, even any slowdowns in that could exacerbate those challenges and prevent them from meeting some of those targets.
Speaking of the economy, there's an angle that is quite interesting. I guess India is interested in attracting tourism to Kashmir. I have not been there, but from the pictures that I have seen, it looks like beautiful. It looks like really, really stunning landscapes. Do you think that the terrorists were actively trying to disrupt India's tourism sector in particular, or it was just an opportunistic attack and many of the victims happened to be tourists, but this was more of a secondary issue and the main goal was not necessarily to impact India's tourism industry?
Yeah, I would say it was fairly opportunistic. This is the attacker is a very low level group. So I think they just were able to infiltrate and, happen to do that. But I think like the fact that, this is, like you said, Kashmir is like a big tourism hub should not be lost in terms of lost on like the implications of like what India is doing. It is trying to transform Kashmir into, this prime tourism destination, and that's what's fueled a lot of this unrest and this animosity in Indian and Kashmir, especially with the Kashmiris, because they feel like they're being driven out, and they feel like it's a form of like settler colonialism. So I think while yes, this group didn't do that to specifically target India's tourism sector, it is something that is a point of contention between local Kashmiris and India.
Yeah, it makes sense, and we have seen militant and terrorist groups around the world targeting tourism destinations because they do want to damage the tourism sector of the country that they are attacking. So I wouldn't be surprised if this was a part of their calculation, maybe not necessarily the main calculation, but part of the equation. A few minutes ago, you mentioned that one of the many things that India did as the conflict was escalating was to suspend the shared water treaty with Pakistan. What are the immediate versus the more long-term implications of this?
Yeah, so I mean, this treaty is still suspended even after the ceasefire, and so this is something that Pakistan is very concerned about. In the short term, because India is upstream and Pakistan's downstream, it has a bit of it has an upper hand on this, and so the concern is that India can control water flow to Pakistan. But like you said, in the immediate term, Pakistan will not lose water right away. India cannot stop these river flows because it does not have the sufficient infrastructure. And this is because, in that treaty, it was outlined that they cannot build dams on these rivers for this very reason. And so this is why the more immediate term risk is that India could refrain from sharing key hydrological data. And this data is what tells Pakistan, whether a flood will happen, or like whether they'll be facing any flooding. And we've already seen reports of that. It hasn't been, very high level, but like just low level of reports of some flooding that hasn't been super detrimental, but nevertheless concerning. But in the long term, the stakes are high. If India builds these dams and effective infrastructure, which reports indicate that they are starting to do so, Pakistan would be hit hard. It relies heavily on this river for agriculture, drinking water, overall food security, and agriculture is a big part of their economy, so that would be hit. And so reinstating this will really be a key focus of Pakistan's discussions with India. And if we see India really actively make moves on this, this could trigger more conflict. Pakistan said that anything to do with water, stopping the flow would be considered an act of war.
That was going to be my next question. Sorry to interrupt you. That was going to be my next question. Considering how vital this is for Pakistan, do you think that if India plays hardball, would this push the Pakistanis to appeasement, or would this irritate the Pakistanis to the point that they become more aggressive vis-a-vis India?
I think it would irritate them, where they would be, more annoyed with India, especially because, like I said, the stakes are quite high, and then also, there's a lot of, I'm aware that, governments don't always operate on domestic pressure, but there is a lot of domestic pressure here. Even when this happened, all the protests that were happening in Pakistan were linked to, this water issue. And so if you have, this internal instability where you're seeing protests and unrest about this, it could potentially drive Pakistan to take a more aggressive stance on it. And so I think it would be, a major risk.
And as we speak, Misha and I here at RANE, we are working on the third quarter forecast. For people listening to us, they probably know that we publish an annual forecast and quarterly updates. And of course, the evolution of the India-Pakistan relations will be a big part of the South Asia section of the third quarter forecast. So I guess my question is, what will happen next? What signposts or events will you be looking at in the next few months?
Yeah, so I mean, the main thing that we'll be tracking and looking at is there's communication between India and Pakistan. It hasn't been, led to any major, developments, but they are talking, and the ceasefire is holding. So the main thing we'll be tracking is if there's any further ceasefire violations, and the key triggers or the signposts would be one. Like I mentioned, India, Pakistan, and that water issue. If we see India making, substantial moves on the river, even though it'll take them years to build, the infrastructure, even like the action of them building that is, escalatory in its nature. So that's a key one. Another thing is, if we have another militant attack, that could be a trigger of, renewed conflict, especially if it's linked to Pakistan or India finds links to Pakistan. That would be a key thing. But the biggest thing that, we've learned from this conflict that's differed from the past ones is that it's been more severe than past confrontations. We saw how deeper, they attacked. Usually it's constrained to the Kashmir region. This time it was more deeper into their respective countries. And so that tells us that, another conflict, it could be a little bit more severe. And the flare-up could result in kinetic action more quickly. So that's the main thing that we're gonna look out for.
So could you please elaborate a bit on that? I wonder what the role of nuclear weapons is. As I said earlier, whenever you're talking about a confrontation between two countries that have nuclear weapons, there's always the risk that an escalation could get really, really, really nasty and really problematic because these are countries that have nuclear weapons. But then again, you don't use a nuclear weapon without a very, very strong justification. So in your opinion, is the fact that both countries have nuclear weapons, is that something that would prevent an escalation of future conflicts and will continue to operate as a deterrence, which I guess has been the case for a number of decades now? Or you think that there is a scenario in which they actually end up using their nuclear weapons?
I think as of now, we're at a point where it is still offering deterrence. It's still, really constraining them from escalating. And so, yeah, I think that will kind of keep this conflict limited. But I mean, if we see, more escalation, and by that, like I mentioned, the water thing, and really India really, and this could be down the line, like years, really straining Pakistan's water access. I mean, that is like a very big trigger for Pakistan. Again, we would have to see how things play out in terms of if it would warrant the use of nuclear arms, but yeah, as of now, I would say the deterrence is still relevant.
And then maybe going in the opposite direction, just to finish this conversation, is there room for a compromise? I know that they've been trying to solve this conflict at least since the late 1940s with very limited success, but in your opinion, is there room for an eventual end to the conflict?
I don't think so. We've talked about like Kashmir and how it's rooted in so many different, factions of conflict, resource, militancy. There's also a national identity element to this. So, each country has their own reasoning for why they would want Kashmir or why they wouldn't settle. So I don't see this ending anytime soon.
Okay. That's good to know. So thank you so much, Misha, for speaking with me today. I am really looking forward to reading the South Asia section of the upcoming third quarter forecast, which we will be publishing in early July. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of really interesting content there, and of course in the rest of the quarterly forecast as well, covering the rest of the planet. So thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking with you today.
Thank you. It was great talking to you as well.
Thank you both for sharing your thoughts and insights on this. As Adriano mentioned, you can read the Q3 forecast and Misha's analysis piece on the outlook for India-Pakistan relations on our platform. To sign up, visit ranenetwork.com, where you can learn more about our suite of risk intelligence products and solutions. That's RANE network.com. Thanks for listening.